Penguin Random House presents Journeys, A Poet's Diary, A.K. Ramanujan. Edited by Krishna Ramanujan and Guillermo Rodriguez. Read by Faraz Khan. Editor's Note and Acknowledgements. The A.K. Ramanujan Papers, stored since 1994 at the Special Collections Research Center at the Joseph Regenstein Library, University of Chicago, contain hundreds of catalogued files, ordered chronologically from 1944 to 1993 in 71 boxes. Since 2014, an additional set of personal diaries and journals, kept in Series 5 of the papers, became accessible to researchers. When we decided to edit a book of the diaries, journals, and other personal notes by Ramanujan, we faced two major challenges. First, there was the vast amount of diverse material to comb through, to obtain a significant selection of texts that were true to our theme of a poet's diary, and that covered the author's literary lifespan from his youth to his death at age 64 in 1993. It was almost by chance that we first discovered the delightful travel journal that Ramanujan wrote in 1959 on his boat journey from Bombay to New York, or the Mescaline Notes he scribbled in 1971, which lay hidden in his poetry drafts. In order to be faithful to Ramanujan's own meticulous working habits, we chose to follow a chronological order. We also did not restrict our search only to the diaries because we intended to trace his creative side, the writer who wrote with all he had in his travel bag, who traversed temporal, intellectual, and cultural spaces with a natural ease. Ramanujan revised and reread his notes and diaries now and again in a continuous dialogue with the past and himself. Ideas, images, and concepts were recirculated and redistilled. He also kept what he called a dream book and a commonplace book. In all these improvised notebooks, including thousands of pages that didn't suit our needs, he recorded his thoughts, feelings, and observations gathered from his travels, meetings, social and academic events, reflections on his writing process, dreams, news items, stories, and anecdotes, as well as translations, lecture texts, reading notes, quotes, and poetry drafts. The second challenge was to focus on the thematic scope of the book. Given the miscellany of the material and our early conviction that this was not meant to be a posthumous autobiography, we found that the thread in Ramanujan's travels and journeying here was a man and artist writing in constant motion, so this had to be a book of real and metaphorical journeys. With this mosaic of texts at hand, we began to compose, piece by piece, a multicultural image of the poet, a likely self-portrait reflecting his artistic credo, writing in process, as well as his intense life journey as a traveler, scholar, and poet in India, Europe, and America. While editing the prose and poetry that is included in this book, we felt it was more representative of Ramanujan's working process to include in the narrative chronology his finished, often previously published, poems side by side with his prose, poetry lines, and drafts from the diaries. This posed an additional task. In all of his work, especially his poetry and translations, Ramanujan was very scientific as a trained linguist, and almost obsessed with language and form. Hence, and also since most of these see the light of day for the first time, we choose to clarify here the criteria applied in editing poetry and material presented here. The book includes 1. Unpublished prose, diaries, journals, dreams, short stories, notes, and one letter. These are mostly handwritten manuscripts, very few were typed, with entries that have been occasionally adapted, as these were not yet intended for publication, in the shape that we found them. We have endeavored to be as loyal as possible to the original, except in those few cases where an edit was needed for clarity. 2. Unpublished poetry, ranging from experimental lines to revised and polished drafts, has been edited only very lightly to reveal the poetic process of the writer, and in order to be faithful to the original. This includes experimental random verse lines originally interspersed between prose and part of the diaries, handwritten, rough drafts of poems that were found with the diaries, handwritten, often dated, drafts of poems, handwritten, not final versions but mostly titled from the poetry folders, which were kept and ordered chronologically. Drafts of poems, typed, titled, and revised by Ramanujan from the poetry folders. As a multilingual poet and translator, Ramanujan was deeply influenced by the form and structure of classical Tamil and medieval Kannada poetry in his own work. In a translator's note to his book, Interior Landscapes, he comments that in translating from classical Tamil to English, his fidelity was to the poem's structure. Each poem had to be interpreted and entirely recreated, the same feelings and ideas, in another language. He notes that he made explicit typographical approximations with spacing and line breaks, for example, and that the Tamil poets had no capitals, punctuation marks, or regular end rhymes, and they used a free word order where positioning of sentence parts carry an effect. We find these same trends in his own original poetry in English, and therefore we felt it important to retain his aesthetic decisions in the drafts and lines. 3. Published poems which were always carefully revised by Ramanujan have been reproduced faithfully from the original publication. These poems have been inserted in the book in select places to show examples of the final polished work, and were chosen on the basis of their relevance to particular themes and allusions in the prose. Ramanujan viewed keeping a diary as part of his creative process. The entries provided a permanent repository for otherwise transient ideas, observations, and language. He believed that by writing them down, they incubated for later use, whether consciously or unconsciously. By placing his published poems in these locations within the diary, we hope to throw light on his method by providing examples of how his disparate notes fed his finished work. Also, this book offers an opportunity to introduce first-time readers of Ramanujan's poetry to a small selection of his meticulously crafted verse. The diaries contain rough and experimental writing, and, without comparison to the end results, a nascent reader of the work may not experience the full magic of his poetic art. This has been a remarkable endeavor for us, and we hope we have succeeded in providing an outline of this fascinating artist's inner world. This book would not have been possible without the help we received along the way. First, we must thank Daniel Mayer, Eileen A. Ilmini, and Jessica Seat at the Special Collections Research Center at the University of Chicago Library for their amazing generosity and support with this project. James H. Nye, bibliographer for Southern Asia, also the University of Chicago Library, Tons N.K. Raju, and Chandan Gowda for their invaluable translations of Kannada and Tamil terms into English. Girish Karnad, our elder statesman, whose efforts have been true friendship to us and AKR. Saksham Garg, for his careful and painstaking transcriptions of handwritten texts into type. The team at Penguin Random House, India, Premanka Goswami, for believing in this project and clearing the path, and just
Sample complete. Ready to continue?